There comes a quiet, invisible turning point in the life of an empath, a moment when they no longer choose chaos disguised as connection, but peace rooted in emotional intelligence. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is a deeply conscious shift from emotional survival to emotional mastery. This moment is not about rejecting people. It is about reclaiming the self. For years, the empath has lived with a heightened sensitivity that feels both like a gift and a burden. They walk into a room and instantly register subtle shifts in tone, posture, silence. Their brain is constantly decoding emotional data, micro-expressions, sighs, pauses between words. This sensitivity is deeply connected to emotional intelligence, a concept widely explored by Daniel Goleman, who emphasizes that self-awareness is the foundation of psychological strength. Yet for many empaths, awareness of others develops long before awareness of self. The awakening begins quietly. It often arrives through exhaustion. The empathy notices that after certain conversations, their body feels heavy. After certain relationships, their thoughts become restless. They replay interactions, wondering what they could have done differently, how they might fix what was never theirs to repair. Slowly, a new awareness forms, not about others, but about their own internal state. They begin to observe patterns. They notice how often they anticipate someone else's needs while dismissing their own. They see how quickly they step in to soothe discomfort, even when no one asks them to. Their empathy, once automatic, starts to feel like emotional overextension. They recognize that constantly absorbing others' emotions has blurred the boundary between compassion and self-neglect. Neuroscience tells us that repeated emotional stress keeps the brain's threat system activated. The empath realizes their nervous system has been living in quiet hypervigilance, scanning for tension, preparing to respond. What once felt like kindness now feels like survival conditioning. This insight is transformative. Instead of asking, how can I help them? They begin asking, what am I feeling right now? It validates their own emotional landscape as worthy of care. They understand that empathy without self-regulation leads to burnout. They begin distinguishing between feeling someone's pain and taking responsibility for it. The guilt that once followed every boundary starts to weaken. This awakening is not dramatic. It is cognitive clarity. It is recognizing that emotional generosity must be balanced with emotional preservation. In this moment, the empath stops measuring love by endurance and starts measuring it by alignment. Loyalty has always been one of the empath's strongest traits. They stay when others leave. They defend when others criticize. They forgive long after apologies stop coming. At first glance, this seems noble, even admirable. But emotional intelligence, as emphasized by Daniel Goleman, teaches that maturity is not measured by how much we tolerate, but by how well we regulate and protect our emotional energy. The empath begins to notice a subtle imbalance in their relationships. They are often the listener, rarely the one being heard. They are the emotional support system, yet their own struggles feel minimized or misunderstood. Slowly they realize that loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-sacrifice. This realization does not make them cynical. It makes them discerning. They start redefining what loyalty truly means. It is no longer about staying through dysfunction or proving devotion through endurance. It becomes about mutual respect, consistent effort, and emotional safety. They understand that healthy relationships are not built on one person's capacity to absorb discomfort. Boundaries enter the picture not as rigid walls, but as clear emotional guidelines. The empath learns to pause before automatically agreeing. They allow themselves to say, I need time, or that doesn't work for me, without spiraling into guilt. This is unfamiliar territory. For someone used to pleasing others, asserting needs can feel uncomfortable at first. But discomfort is not danger, it is growth. Psychologically, this shift reflects stronger self-concept and internal validation. Instead of seeking approval through availability, the empath begins valuing balance. They observe who respects their limits and who resists them. That observation becomes data. Patterns reveal themselves. In redefining loyalty, the empath stops equating love with self-abandonment. They recognize that staying in emotionally draining dynamics does not prove depth. It erodes identity. Loyalty becomes selective, intentional, grounded in self-respect rather than fear of loss. Peace becomes tangible when the empath begins to understand the biology behind their exhaustion. Emotional sensitivity is not only psychological, it is physiological. The body keeps score. Prolonged exposure to tension, unpredictability, or emotional volatility activates the stress response system. Cortisol rises, the heart rate subtly increases, muscles remain slightly contracted. Over time, this constant activation becomes normalized, even though it quietly drains vitality. Drawing again from principles associated with emotional intelligence and regulation discussed by Daniel Goleman, the empath realizes that managing emotions also means managing environments. They begin to notice how certain people leave them feeling calm and expanded, while others trigger tightness in the chest or mental fog. Instead of dismissing these signals, they start respecting them as data from the nervous system. This is a profound shift. Rather than intellectualizing every interaction, they tune into bodily cues. A headache after a conversation, fatigue after repeated exposure to negativity, restlessness before meeting someone who thrives on drama. These sensations are no longer ignored. They are interpreted. The empath understands that their body is not overreacting. It is communicating. They start making quieter choices, spending more time in spaces that feel predictable and grounded, limiting exposure to chaotic personalities, choosing silence over constant stimulation, prioritizing sleep, solitude, and restorative activities without labeling them as selfish. What once felt like withdrawal now feels like regulation. There is also a release of responsibility. The empath recognizes that they cannot stabilize every emotional storm around them. They are not required to mediate every conflict or soothe every insecurity. By stepping back, they allow others to confront their own emotional patterns. This creates space both physically and psychologically. Calm stops feeling unfamiliar. It becomes desirable. The nervous system begins to settle, shifting from survival mode into a state of balance. The empath discovers that peace is not the absence of care. It is the presence of internal safety. One of the most defining aspects of this transformation is how quietly it happens. When the empath begins to detach from what disrupts their inner stability, it is not fueled by anger or revenge. It is guided by alignment. In earlier phases of life, they may have tried to explain themselves repeatedly, hoping that clarity would create change. They over-articulated their feelings, justified their boundaries, and attempted to be understood at all costs. But emotional maturity introduces a new realization. Not everyone is committed to understanding. Inspired by the deeper dimensions of emotional intelligence explored by Daniel Goleman, the empath starts recognizing that emotional energy is finite. Every argument, every attempt to prove sincerity, every effort to repair what others continually break carries a psychological price. They begin asking a different question, not how do I fix this, but is this aligned with who I am becoming? Letting go without hatred requires remarkable self-regulation. The empath resists the temptation to dramatize the exit. There are no explosive confrontations, no public declarations. Instead, there is gradual disengagement. They stop volunteering emotional labor. They shorten conversations that revolve around negativity. They decline invitations that feel obligatory rather than genuine. Their absence becomes the boundary. There is grief in this process. Empaths invest deeply, and detachment feels like cutting through layers of shared memories and imagined futures. They allow themselves to feel that sadness without turning it into self-blame. They understand that mourning a connection does not mean returning to it. This stage reflects a powerful cognitive shift. Closure does not always require confrontation. Sometimes clarity is internal. The empath releases the need to be validated by those who benefit from misunderstanding them. They accept that some relationships functioned as lessons, not lifelong alignments. In choosing to walk away with composure rather than resentment, the empath protects their emotional integrity. They no longer carry anger as proof of strength. They carry calm as evidence of growth. For much of their life, the empathized identity has been intertwined with being needed. They were the mediator in conflicts, the late-night listener, the one who sensed unspoken pain and rushed to soften it. Over time, this role became more than behavior. It became self-definition. Their value felt directly connected to their usefulness. When others were stable, they felt purposeful. When others were in crisis, they felt indispensable. As emotional awareness deepens, a process strongly aligned with the frameworks of self-mastery described by Daniel Goleman, the empath begins questioning this identity. They ask themselves who they are outside of emotional law. Bore. If no one needed saving, fixing, or stabilizing, what would remain? This question can feel disorienting at first. Without constant external demands, there is silence. And in that silence, the empathy encounters parts of themselves long postponed: creativity, curiosity, ambition, rest. They realize how often their own goals were delayed because someone else required immediate attention. They notice how frequently they adjusted their personality to match the emotional climate of others. Reclaiming identity means allowing authenticity to replace adaptation. The empath stops shape-shifting to maintain harmony. They express preferences without scanning the room for approval. They pursue interests without calculating how it will serve someone else. This shift is subtle but profound. They move from being externally defined to internally directed. There's also a strengthening of self-respect. Instead of earning validation through sacrifice, they begin cultivating it through alignment. They acknowledge their strengths without tying them exclusively to caregiving. Empathy remains a trait, but it is no longer their sole currency. This reclamation fosters confidence. Decisions become clearer because they are no longer filtered through the question, how will this affect everyone else? But rather, does this reflect who I am becoming? In stepping beyond the role of constant caretaker, the empath discovers a fuller identity, one that includes compassion, but is not confined by it. As this inner transformation stabilizes, something unexpected begins to happen. The empath's relational world changes, not because they are trying to attract different people, but because their emotional frequency has shifted. Emotional intelligence, a framework articulated extensively by Daniel Goleman, suggests that self-regulation and self-awareness directly influence the quality of our social interactions. When the empath becomes more grounded, their standards subtly rise. They are no longer magnetized by intensity alone. In the past, emotional highs and dramatic vulnerability may have felt like depth. Now, consistency feels deeper. Predictability feels safer. They start valuing people who communicate clearly, respect boundaries, and take responsibility for their emotions. Chaos loses its appeal. This is not about becoming selective out of superiority. It is about resonance. When the empath no longer over-explains, over-gives, or over-functions, those who relied on that excess gradually drift away. What remains, or newly enters, are individuals who operate from emotional accountability. Conversations feel balanced. Silence feels comfortable rather than tense. Disagreements do not threaten the bond. The empath also becomes less reactive. Instead of absorbing another person's frustration, they observe it. Instead of rushing to soothe insecurity, they allow space for self-resolution. This shift creates healthier dynamics because it removes the imbalance of one-sided emotional labor. Relationships begin to feel lighter, not because they lack seriousness, but because they lack emotional dependency. Trust develops differently now. It is built on patterns rather than promises. The empath pays attention to behavior over words. They no longer chase potential. They respond to consistency. This discernment acts as a filter, naturally aligning them with people who are capable of mutual